This urban legend is called 8 Feet Tall, and it's about a very terrifying, very tall creature that takes the form of a woman and preys on children. You'll know when she's near because you'll hear
po, po, po.
My grandparents lived in Japan, and every summer my parents would take me there to visit them. They lived in a small village and they had a very big backyard that I loved. When we arrived, my grandparents always welcomed me with open arms, and I was their only grandchild, so they spoiled me. The last time I saw them was this summer when I was 8 years old. My parents booked a flight to Japan and we drove from the airport to my grandparents' house. They were delighted to see me and they had a lot of presents to give me. My parents wanted to have some time by themselves, so after a few days, they took a trip to another part of Japan, leaving me with my grandma and grandpa. One day I was playing out in the yard and my grandparents were inside the house. It was a hot day and I laid down on the grass to rest. I stared up at the clouds and enjoyed the feeling of the soft rays of the sun and the gentle breeze. Just as I was about to get up, I heard a strange sound. I didn't know what it was, and it was hard to figure out where it was coming from. It sounded almost like somebody was making the noise themselves, as if they were just saying
po, po, po
over and over again in a deep masculine voice. I was looking around trying to figure out where the noise was coming from when I suddenly noticed something on top of the tall hedges that enclosed the backyard. It was a straw hat. It wasn't resting on the hedge, it was behind it. That's where the sound was coming from. Then the hat began to move. It stopped at a small gap in the hedge and I could see a face looking at me. It was a woman, but the hedges were high, almost 8 feet tall. I was surprised at how tall this woman was. I wondered if she was wearing stilts or some sort of huge high-heeled shoes. Then, a second later, she walked off and the strange noise disappeared with her, fading into the distance. Confused, I got up and wandered back into the house. My grandparents were in the kitchen drinking tea, and I sat down at the table and I told my grandparents what I saw. They weren't really paying much attention to me until I mentioned that distinctive sound.
Po, po, po.
As soon as I said that, both of them froze. Grandma's eyes grew wide and she covered her mouth with her hand. Grandpa's face became very serious and he grabbed me by my arm. "This is very important," he says in an intense voice. "You must tell me exactly how tall was she?" As tall as the garden hedge. I was really beginning to get scared at this point. My grandfather started bombarding me with questions. Where was she standing? When did this happen? What did you do? Did she see you? I tried to answer all of his questions as best as I could, and he rushed out to the hallway and made a phone call. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but beside me, Grandma was trembling. Grandpa came barging back into the room and he said to my grandmother, "I've got to go out for a while. You stay here with the child and don't take your eyes off of him for a second." I started crying and I asked him what was wrong. He looked at me with a sad expression in his eyes and he said, "She likes you. You've been chosen by her." With that, he rushed out, got into his truck, and he drove off. I turned to my grandmother and cautiously asked, "Who is he talking about?" "Don't worry," she said in a shaking voice. "Grandpa will do something. There's no need to worry." As we stood nervously in the kitchen waiting for my grandfather to come back, she explained what was happening. She told me there was a dangerous thing that was haunting the area. They called it Hachishakusama because of its height. Hachishakusama means 8 feet tall. It takes on the appearance of an extremely tall woman in a deep male voice.
Po, po, po.
It appears differently depending on who sees it. Some say it looks like a haggard old woman in a kimono, and others say it's a girl in a white funeral shroud. One thing that never changes is its height and the sound that it makes. A long time ago, it was captured by monks and they managed to confine it in a ruined building on the outskirts of the village. They trapped it using 4 small religious statues called jizo that they placed at the north, south, east, and west of the ruins, and it wasn't supposed to be able to move from there, but somehow it managed to escape. The last time it appeared was 15 years ago, and my grandmother said that anyone who saw it was destined to die within a few days. It all sounded crazy and I wasn't sure what to believe. When Grandpa came back, there was an old woman with him. She introduced herself as Kei-san and handed me a small crumpled piece of parchment saying, "Here, take this and hold it." Then she and Grandpa went upstairs to do something and I was left alone in the kitchen with my grandmother again. I needed to go to the bathroom and Granny followed me and she wouldn't even let me shut the door, and I was beginning to get really scared. After a while, Grandpa and Kei-san took me upstairs into my room. The windows had been covered in newspaper. There were small bowls of salt in all 4 corners of my room, and a small Buddha figure had been placed at the center of the room on top of a wooden box. There was also a bright blue bucket. What's the bucket for? I asked. That's your bathroom. Kay-san set me down on the bed and said, soon the sun will be setting, so listen carefully. You must stay in this room until tomorrow morning. You must not come out under any circumstances until 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. Your grandfather and your grandmother will not speak to you or call you until then. Remember, do not leave the room for any reason, and I will let your parents know what's going on. She spoke in such a grave tone that all I could do was quietly nod my head. You have to follow Kay-san's instructions to the letter, Grandpa told me, and never let go of the parchment she gave you. And if anything happens, pray to Buddha and make sure you lock this door when we leave. They walked out into the hallway, and after I said goodbye to them, I closed the door and I locked it. And I turned on the TV and I tried to watch it, but I was so nervous and I felt sick to my stomach. So Grandma had left some snacks and some rice balls for me, but I couldn't eat them. I felt like I was in prison and I was very depressed and very scared. I laid on the bed and I waited. Before I knew it, I was asleep. When I woke up, it was just after 1 in the morning, and all of a sudden I realized that something was tapping on the window. I felt the blood draining from my face and my heart skipped a beat. I desperately tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was just the branches of a tree. I turned up the volume on the TV to drown out the tapping noise. Eventually, it stopped altogether. That was when I heard my grandpa calling me. Are you okay in there? He asked. If you're scared, you don't have to stay in there all alone. I can come in and keep you company. I smiled and rushed over to open the door, but then I stopped in my tracks. I had goosebumps all over my body. It sounded like my grandpa's voice, but somehow it was different. I couldn't tell you what was different, but I just knew. What are you doing, Grandpa asked. You can open the door now. I glanced to my left and a chill went down my spine. The salt in the bowls was slowly turning black. I backed away from the door. My whole body was trembling with fear, and I fell to my knees in front of the Buddha statue and clenched the piece of parchment tightly in my hand. I started desperately praying for help. Please save me. Then I heard the voice outside the door saying,
Poke, poke, poke.
The tapping on the window started up again. I was overcome by fear and I crouched there in front of the statue. I was half crying and half praying for the rest of the night. I felt like it would never end, but eventually it was morning. The salt in all 4 bowls was pitch black. I checked my watch. It was 7:30 in the morning, so I slowly opened the door. Grandma and Kay-san were standing outside waiting for me, and when she saw my face, Grandma burst into tears. I'm so glad you're alive, she said. I went downstairs and I was surprised to see my father and my mother sitting in the kitchen. Grandpa came in and said, hurry up, we've got to get going. We went to the front door and there was a large black van waiting in the driveway, and several men from the village were standing around it, pointing at me and whispering, that's the boy. The van was a 9-seater and they put me in the middle, surrounded by 8 men, and Kay-san was in the driver's seat. The man on my left looked down at me and said, you've got yourself in quite a spot of trouble. I know you're probably worried. Just keep your head down and your eyes shut. We can't see it, but you can. Don't open your eyes until we've got you safely out of here. Grandpa drove in the car in front and my dad followed behind us. When everyone was ready, our little convoy started moving. We were going pretty slow, around 20 kilometers per hour or 12 miles an hour. And after a while, Kay-san said, this is where it gets hard, and started muttering a prayer under her breath. That was when I heard that voice.
Poke, poke, poke.
I clutched the parchment that Kay-san had given me tightly in my hand, and I kept my head down, but I peeked out the window. I saw a white dress fluttering in the breeze, and it was moving along with the van. It was her. She was outside the window, and now she was right beside us. Then suddenly she bent down and she looked into the van. No, I screamed, and the man beside me shouted, close your eyes. I immediately shut my eyes as hard as I could, and I tightened my grip on the piece of parchment. Then the tapping began. The voice became louder.
Poke, poke, poke.
There was tapping on the windows all around us, and all of the men in the van were startled and they were on edge, and they were talking low and nervously to themselves. They couldn't see her and they couldn't hear her voice, but they could hear her tapping on the windows. And Kay-san started praying louder and louder until she was almost shouting, and the tension inside the van was unbearable. After a while, the tapping stopped and the voice disappeared. Kay-san looked back at us and said, I think we're safe now. The van pulled over to the side of the road and the men got out, and they transferred me into my dad's car. My mother held me close with tears running down her cheeks. My grandpa and my father bowed to the men and they went on their way. Kay-san came to the window and asked me to show her the parchment that she had given me. When I opened my hand, I saw that it had gone completely black. "I think you will be okay now," she said. "But just to be sure, hold on to this for a while." She handed me a new piece of parchment. After that, we drove straight to the airport and Grandpa saw us safely onto the plane. And when we took off, my parents breathed a sigh of relief. My father told me he had heard about 8 Feet Tall before. Years ago, his friend had been liked and chosen by her. My father said that there were other people who had been liked by her and that lived to tell about it. They all had to leave Japan and move outside of the country. They were never able to go back to their homeland. She almost always chooses children as her victims. They say it's because children are dependent on their parents and their family members, and this makes them easier to deceive when she poses as their relatives. He said that the men that were in the van were all blood relatives of mine, and that's why they had been sitting all around me, and while my father and grandpa had been driving in front and in the back. It was all done to try and confuse Hachishakusama. It took a while to contact everyone and to get them all together, so that's why I had to be confined in my room that night. He told me that one of the little Jizo statues, the ones that were meant to keep her trapped, had been broken, and that's how she escaped. It gave me chills when I heard that, and I was so glad to finally be back home. All of this happened more than 10 years ago, and I haven't seen my grandparents since, but I called them every few weeks. Over the years, I tried to convince myself that it was just an urban legend, that everything that happened was just some elaborate prank, but sometimes I'm not so sure. My grandfather died 2 years ago. When he was sick, he wouldn't allow me to visit him, and he left strict instructions in his will that I wasn't to attend his funeral. It was so sad. My grandmother called. She said that she had been diagnosed with cancer. She missed me terribly and wanted to see me one last time before she died. "Are you sure, Grandma?" I asked her. "Is it safe?" "It's been 10 years," she said. "All that happened a long time ago. It's all forgotten. You're all grown up now. I'm sure it won't be a problem." But what about Hachishakusama?" I said. For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the phone. Then I heard a deep, masculine voice saying,
Poke, poke, poke.